All right, this will be a video about the 1986 Challenger space shuttle explosion and the mystery of whether the people who were on the shuttle are actually still living and didn't actually die in 1986 when the space shuttle exploded. And this is such an incredible, bizarre, just unbelievable mystery. It's a really strange one. You might be familiar with it. It's pretty popular on TikTok and Instagram, and there's a number of articles and videos and whatnot out there about this. So we'll just kind of run through the basics real quick of this kind of Challenger mystery. But what we'll really focus more on in this video is whether this whole thing could be connected to the Iran-Contra scandal. Because the question that always comes up when you talk about this really bizarre possibility that these astronauts didn't die in 1986 and they're still living, the question that always comes up is, well, why would anyone do this? If this was just a big hoax and their deaths were faked, why would you fake their deaths? Why would you blow up the space shuttle? Because the shuttle did blow up. That's not really a question or anything that people debate. The shuttle blew up. It's just a question of, well, were these astronauts actually on the shuttle when it blew up? And if they weren't on the shuttle, why would you just blow the thing up? Why would you just blow up a space shuttle? Seemingly, it makes no sense. But if you kind of look at it and examine Iran-Contra, which was kind of was going on at this time, but it wasn't known to the public. Iran-Contra was such a massive scandal, and we'll kind of look at whether there might have been a connection between these two events. And as far as the Challenger explosion goes, we'll just kind of run through the basics of that real quick here, and then we'll kind of get into the Iran-Contra connection. And then at the end of the video, we'll return to this Challenger mystery and kind of cover some of the more interesting details on, whether these astronauts could still be alive. Again, everybody knows the Challenger explosion, January 28th, 1986, probably the defining moment of the 1980s, probably the biggest event that happened, or at least the most widely covered event. And that happened in 1986. And then the strangest thing happened 30 years later when these astronauts, these people who supposedly died in the crash, were potentially found by people on the internet. And most of these people still had the exact same names. They looked nearly identical, or in some cases, absolutely identical. And there were all these kind of like weird characteristics and details about their lives once people started kind of digging into them. And so the obvious question was, wait a second here. Did these people not actually die in the space shuttle crash? Were they actually not on board the space shuttle? And it's just a really fascinating, really bizarre story. We'll just kind of run through each of the astronauts here real quick, and the astronauts, quote unquote, and talk a bit about kind of the doppelgangers or whatever that were found 30 years later in the astronauts. So this was Judith Resnick. She was found in 2015. She was 65 years old. And that's the exact age that the Challenger astronaut, Judith Resnick, on the left there would have been. This Judith Resnick was a law professor at Yale. Now, obviously, the name Judith Resnick, I mean, that's not a common name. That's a very unique name. She still had the same name. People kind of looked into her, and she had kind of the same mannerisms and some of the same facial features and facial tics as the astronaut. And again, she was a law professor at Yale. This guy was found, Michael Smith. He was 69 years old in 2015, which was the exact age that the Challenger astronaut, Michael Smith, would have been. This guy is just a freaking dead ringer for the astronaut. They look identical. And this Michael Smith was also a college professor. He taught engineering at the University of Wisconsin. So again, it was the same name, same face, and the same age. This is Michael Smith's profile on the University of Wisconsin's website. And then there was Krista McAuliffe. She was kind of like the face of the Challenger mission in 1986. She was a school teacher who had been selected as part of a program called Teachers in Space, where NASA wanted to send a teacher into space along with these astronauts. And there was this big competition, like 70,000 teachers entered. She was chosen and won the competition. We'll get into this a little later, but I actually find this whole competition thing a little suspicious and wonder if there wasn't kind of more going on with this whole story of her just being chosen out of 70,000 applicants. But anyway, she was kind of considered the the face of the Challenger expedition in 1986. Her real name was Sharon McAuliffe, and a search was done, and a Sharon McAuliffe was found, and she was also a college professor. So that's three college professors. She was a professor of law at Syracuse. And then this guy was found, Dick Scobie, Richard Scobie. He is a total dead ringer for the astronaut Dick Scobie. And this Richard Scobie was the CEO of an advertising firm in Chicago called Cows with Trees. There are all these kind of like really little interesting details about his advertising firm on the homepage of the firm on the website. There was like this animation where this cow is flying on a jetpack through the sky, and it makes this kind of like jet stream of and a pattern that was very similar to the pattern that was left by the Challenger crash or the Challenger explosion when it happened. And there were like these subtle little interesting little references and things like that to space shuttles. Here's one of the Facebook posts showing a space shuttle launching. And then there were these two astronauts. There was Ellison Azanuka on the top and then Ron McNair on the bottom. They both supposedly had brothers who looked nearly identical to the actual astronauts. These weren't like identical twins or anything like that. They were just brothers who happened to be right around the same age, who bore a striking resemblance to the astronauts. And so Ellison Azanuka, the astronaut, his brother was named Claude Azanuka. And there's kind of some debate on whether this guy even exists. He's not ever mentioned in like newspapers or magazines at the time of the crash. It was never mentioned that Ellison Azanuka had a brother. And if you kind of look closely, you'll even see that like both Ellison and Claude have the same like crow's feet wrinkles at the corners of their eyes. They're a little more pronounced with quote unquote Claude, but they line up just absolutely perfectly. And someone even did a search on Ancestry.com for this Claude Azanuka, and nothing came up. And then there was the astronaut Ron McNair on the left there. His brother Carl was found, who looks pretty much identical to Ron. It's an interesting case because there's like some indications that this Carl McNair is actually a real person and he does exist. And there's other indications that it's the same person as Ron McNair. A ancestry search for Carl McNair was done as well, and nothing was found for him. Also, no birth records or anything like that. But there's also some other kind of weird and interesting things about Carl McNair and these other people who were found. We will get into kind of some of the more interesting details later on. I just wanted to kind of run through the basics of this really bizarre Challenger mystery here at first and kind of shift over to talking about the connection to the Iran-Contra scandal. But again, the whole question of this is, were these people actually on board the Space Shuttle Challenger when it exploded? Or were they just filmed boarding the space shuttle, and then after they'd boarded and all the cameras had left, they were taken off and the space shuttle was launched without anybody on it and then just blown up? And one interesting thing that is significant, I think, is that this was basically a military operation. Four of these people had very, very extensive backgrounds in the military and with the military. And two of the people worked for major, major military contractors. So the teacher, Krista McAuliffe, was the only one who didn't have like a big military background. Everyone else either came from the military or worked for a major military contractor. That's something to kind of keep in mind as we dive into this a bit more. And the question that's always brought up is why? That's the obvious question is, well, why would you blow up a space shuttle if these people's deaths were faked and they weren't actually on the space shuttle and this whole explosion of the Challenger was actually done on purpose or planned in advance? Why would you just blow up a space shuttle? Why would you want to do that? Why would you hoax their deaths? Why would you pull off this big elaborate thing? It seemingly makes no sense at all. But what we're going to look at was whether this Challenger explosion was a staged event that was used as a distraction to distract people from a couple other really major, major things that were going on at this time. And so we'll look at this super duper suspicious plane crash that happened in Canada just a few short weeks before the Challenger explosion. And then that plane crash was potentially tied in with Iran-Contra. And the Iran-Contra scandal was just the most insane scandal ever. It was so massive. And these other events were all happening right at the exact time of this Challenger explosion. So we'll talk about these other two events real quick here and then kind of try to tie all three of these events together. And the first thing we'll look at is one of the most suspicious, mysterious plane crashes of all time. This is an absolutely massive mystery that has just kind of been forgotten about with time. It happened in Gander, Canada, so it's kind of known as the Gander plane crash, but it involved a US plane that was carrying 248 US soldiers home from the Middle East, and everyone on board died. This is the worst air disaster in the history of the US military. And this happened on December 12th, 1985. So again, it was just a very few weeks before the Challenger crash. And kind of the story of this whole Gander plane crash starts in 1979 when this thing called the Treaty of Peace was signed between Israel and Egypt. Israel and Egypt were constantly at war during this time. They finally signed something called the Treaty of Peace that laid out all these stipulations for peace. And the United Nations assigned a multinational group of soldiers to go to the border of Israel and Egypt and patrol it and make sure that, both sides were, kind of adhering to the terms of the treaty. And so there was this division, the 101st Airborne Division out of Fort Campbell, Kentucky. They were assigned to be a part of this United Nations peacekeeping group and monitor the Israel-Egypt border. And they were over there for like 6 months. On December 12th, 1985, they were returning from this 6-month mission, and they flew from the Middle East over to North America. They stopped at the airport in Gander, Canada, to refuel. And then 19 seconds after taking off, after landing to refuel, the plane crashed, and all 256 people on board died. 8 crew members of the plane and 248 members of the army. And from the start, there was this huge, huge controversy over what actually caused this plane crash. The official story was that ice on the wings had caused the plane crash. Flew from the Middle East and then landed in Canada, and then it was really cold in December in Canada, obviously. Ice formed on the wings and it caused the plane to lose control after it had taken off, and then it crashed into the ground. That was the official story. But there were all these reports from eyewitnesses who claimed that the plane had basically just exploded in the sky. It wasn't that it crashed into the ground, it exploded into the sky. And the Royal Canadian Mounted Police obtained sworn statements from 5 witnesses who saw the plane on fire before it actually fell to the ground. There was a rental car agent who was warming up cars and saw the whole thing. She said the night sky just lit up, and she has this quote here. She says, "It just blew up and went everywhere, burning like cinders falling to the earth." And then there were reports from rescue workers who found bodies just burnt beyond recognition that were hanging from trees that weren't touched by flames at all. So that indicated that, again, the bodies had caught on fire and been charred while they were in the air and then fallen into the trees because the trees were, untouched by flames. And then there were lethal doses of carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide found in the lungs of the dead bodies. That indicated that these people had inhaled all this smoke while they were still living, which obviously contradicted the official story that the plane had just lost control and then crashed into the ground and everybody died on the impact. And one of the real mysteries about the flight was that there were these mysterious wooden crates, these wooden boxes that were loaded onto the plane right before it departed from Cairo, Egypt. And these wooden boxes were described as coffin sized, about 6 feet by 2 feet. And there was about 15 to 20 of them that were loaded onto the Gander flight. And in order to make room for these crates, there were 41 duffel bags belonging to soldiers on the flight. There were 41 duffel bags that were removed from the cargo hold and taken off the flight. Apparently, that's like a very rare thing to separate a soldier from his equipment and his duffel bag. It just, is really frowned upon. And so that was kind of a mystery. Like, well, what was in these wooden crates or these wooden boxes that was so important that they took the place of all these soldiers' duffel bags and their equipment? And it was never determined what exactly was in these mysterious wooden crates. It was never figured out, but there was a lot of speculation that one of them could have been concealing a bomb, and that bomb was used to, blow up the plane. And if there was a bomb in one of these crates and a foreign country was responsible for smuggling it onto the flight and blowing the plane up, obviously that's an act of terrorism, a very serious act of terrorism. And so, as there was all this kind of speculation on if a bomb had maybe been in one of the crates and blown the plane up, as there was all this speculation, people started thinking like there was way more to the story of this crash than initially thought. And since there were all these mysteries and rumors and just all these unanswered questions about this plane crash, which again was the worst air disaster in the history of the US military, there was this intense pressure from the media, from the public, and certainly from the victims' families to investigate the crash and, figure out what had caused it. And one thing people started looking into was what exactly these people were up to, these soldiers were up to in the Middle East. And it was learned on the plane that had crashed there were also 20 members of Task Forces 160 and 163. And these were elite counterterrorism units that were often used on hostage rescue missions. And so the question kind of became, well, what were these guys doing over here? Because again, officially, all these people who died in the crash were on a peacekeeping mission to monitor the border between Israel and Egypt. This was just a peacekeeping mission. So why was there this elite counterterrorism, 20 members of this elite counterterrorism unit also deployed on this? And that just added to the mystery and intrigue of this flight and what exactly these soldiers were up to. Was it really a peacekeeping mission or was there way more to the story? And there kept being, pressure from the media and pressure from the public to investigate this and figure out, what was the cause of this disaster that had killed 248 US soldiers and was the worst air disaster in the history of the US military. The family members of the victims of the crash eventually reached the point where they just flat out accused the government of covering this whole thing up. But maybe the biggest controversy with the Gander crash happened when the Iran-Contra scandal broke around this time. And there were kind of like some suspicious links of some of the passengers on the Gander flight to this Iran-Contra scandal. And so people started kind of wondering and thinking that maybe the Gander disaster was related in some way to covering up Iran-Contra or maybe eliminating people who'd been involved or eliminating whistleblowers or witnesses. So we'll just kind of run through the basics of Iran-Contra real quick and kind of talk about how this ties into everything else. This whole Iran-Contra scandal was just so absolutely freaking massive. So much was going on here. And, it really did almost bring down Ronald Reagan, and not just Ronald Reagan, but so many people close to him, so many powerful people, Vice President Bush, a whole bunch of really high up CIA people. I mean, this Iran Contra thing involved some seriously powerful people. And so, how it started, officially at least, was in early 1985. This terrorist group in the Middle East that was kind of like associated with Iran. They took a group of Americans hostage, and there was a group in the U.S. government who kind of reached an arrangement where they would sell missiles to Iran in the hopes of getting these hostages back from this terrorist group that Iran was kind of close with. Now, this group in America who started selling these missiles did this without telling Congress, did this without, getting approval or anything like that. They just did it all on their own. They marked up these missiles like insanely, like millions of dollars, and they netted a ton of money because they kept just constantly selling Iran missiles. And then the money that they made, the millions that this group in the government was making, then they funneled that money down to this group in Nicaragua who was trying to overthrow the government. They were referred to as the Contras. And this group in the US didn't like the Nicaraguan government, so they wanted to support the Contras and wanted to see the, Nicaraguan government overthrown. Unfortunately for them, this was highly illegal because just, a few years earlier, like a bill had been passed that banned any sort of aid to these Nicaraguan Contra fighters. So anyway, this whole kind of arrangement went on all throughout 1985 and all throughout 1986, but like outside people, the media, the public, the press, no one knew about that this was going on. Now, the only reason this got exposed was this guy, Eugene Hassenfuss. He was involved in transporting weapons to the Contras, and in late 1986, his plane was shot down, and he was taken as a prisoner by the Nicaraguan government, and he just told everything to him. He confessed it all about, the U.S. supplying weapons to the Contras, and the media got wind of this, and it just turned into this massive thing that became known as Iran-Contra. This is Oliver North. He was kind of considered the face of this whole Iran-Contra thing. And this story was just everywhere throughout late 1986 and all throughout 1987. Just to give you an idea of how big this was, I mean, this is like what the TV guide looked like during these hearings that went on for months. It was on every channel, and it was the talk of the nation. Now, this story was really way more than meets the eye, because the really interesting thing about Iran Contra is that it exposed this group in Washington, D.C., that referred to themselves as the Enterprise. And you always hear terms like the deep state or the shadow government. And that's exactly what the Enterprise was. And this was exposed during the Iran Contra hearings. This group, in our own government, the Enterprise, they were the ones selling missiles to Iran and making all this money from these sales. And during the Iran-Contra hearings, this senator from Hawaii, his name was Daniel Inouye, he described the enterprise as a shadowy government with its own air force, its own navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances, and free from the law itself. And that was, the totally shocking part about Iran Contra, because it came out just how powerful and massive this enterprise group was. They had their own fighter jets, their own ships, their own army, their own spies. They were basically like a government within a government, just kind of doing whatever they felt and whatever they felt was best for them personally. So that's kind of like a brief overview of the official Iran Contra story, but most likely there was way, 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 way more going on behind the scenes. There have been a number of like whistleblowers and investigators who've talked about how the true story of what was going on with Iran Contra was just so much more massive than what emerged during the Iran Contra hearings. This guy Al Martin claimed he was very intimately involved in the whole Iran Contra operation, and he wrote an expose years later. He described himself as a fourth level player, just below George W. Bush, and Jeb Bush. So he was very high up in this, and he goes into a lot of detail in his book. And this is how Iran Contra was described in his book. This is how he kind of talks about what was really going on here. He says Iran Contra is a euphemism for the outrageous fraud perpetuated by the government officials for profit and control. Offhandedly, this inaccurate term entered history as shorthand for for the public scandal of illicit arms sales to Iran, coupled with the illicit weapons deals for Nicaragua. The real story, however, is much more complex. When George Bush, Bill Casey, and Oliver North initiated their plan of government-sanctioned fraud and drug smuggling, they envisioned using 500 men to raise $35 billion. When Iran-Contra finally fell apart, they ended up using about 5,000 operatives and making over $350 billion in covert revenues. And this Al Martin names George Bush as the guy who was at the top of the pyramid here and was the one kind of orchestrating this whole Iran-Contra thing. Again, he claims what was revealed was really only just a fraction, only just a tip of the iceberg. So the point is, this Iran-Contra thing was just off the charts wild. Just the official story is absolutely crazy. Just to give you an idea of just how crazy this whole thing was, Bud McFarlane was Ronald Reagan's national security advisor. He attempted suicide, quote unquote, 2 hours before he was going to testify in Iran-Contra. Bill Casey, who ran the CIA at the time, he just died during the hearings. And then maybe you've heard of Gary Webb. He was an investigative journalist, and his book Dark Alliance is honestly considered one of the best investigative works of all time. He claims in Dark Alliance that the Contras were actually supplying drugs to the Enterprise in exchange for these weapons that the Enterprise was providing them. And then the Enterprise was flooding inner cities with these drugs, and they were just making an absolute fortune. And the reason this ties in with the Gander Crash is, well, first of all, the timing. The Gander Crash happened in December of 1985, and that was just right during the heart of Iran-Contra and everything that was going on with it. Iran-Contra was still secret in 1985. The public had never heard of it, but the whole Iran-Contra thing was going on behind the scenes, unknown to the public. And if you look at the Gander flight, obviously these soldiers had been on a quote unquote peacekeeping mission in the Middle East, and obviously Iran is right in that area. There was also this elite counterterrorism unit who were often used on hostage rescue missions, and they were on the Gander flight. They had been, in the Iran area as well. And if you remember, Iran Contra started, the whole thing started because there was this terrorist group holding US citizens hostage. And then the Enterprise started selling missiles to Iran in hopes of getting the hostages returned. So there was kind of like this interesting hostage connection, and it was even speculated that there might have been like some sort of secret mission to try and save these hostages with this elite counterterrorism unit. Now, once Iran Contra was revealed in late 1986, there were a lot of people who kind of looked back on this Gander crash and wondered if there wasn't some sort of connection. There were all these like links that sort of emerged. This is a quote from a private investigator who was hired by the families who'd lost someone in the Gander crash. And what he said was if the truth about this crash had gotten out in 1985, it would have exposed the Iran Contra scandal 1 year before it became public. So that's pretty much exactly what we were just talking about. And then this quote was from a family member who lost someone in the crash. She says, "It just seems to me it had to do with the Iran arms deal or fear on the part of the administration that the deal would be exposed." And it was also later learned that this Gander crash happened at a really curious time when the whole Iran Contra scandal, because one thing that happened right around the time of the Gander crash was that the Enterprise had sold Iran these faulty missiles that didn't work. And Iran was really pissed because they'd been totally gypped. The missiles were supposed to be, in exchange for these hostages. And there was talk about this whole thing just blowing up in their faces. In fact, 3 days before the Gander crash, Oliver North, this is what he wrote in a memo. He said, "To stop now in midstream would ignite Iranian fire. Hostages would be our minimum losses." So again, he wrote this 3 days before the Gander crash. They were concerned that this whole Iran Contra thing was just going to absolutely turn into this total mess. And another interesting thing was that this flight that crashed in Gander was operated by a company named Aero Air. And this Aero Air airline was the company used in Iran Contra for shipments of weapons and drugs. And it was rumored to be majorly connected to the CIA. So the fact that it just happened to be an Aero Air flight that crashed in Gander, it was definitely a little suspicious. And then Iran-Contra was revealed in late 1986, and all these super duper powerful CIA people were linked to it. It was, basically a who's who of the CIA who had connections to Iran-Contra. And then people said, okay, wait a second. If the CIA was majorly involved in Iran-Contra for the past 2 years, and this airline that crashed and killed all these soldiers in Gander, Canada, was also linked to the CIA, that's very suspicious. So, with all these questions that emerged, people started wondering if this plane really was blown up with a bomb. Was it a foreign country? Were there people in our own government behind sabotaging this plane? Was there some just massive cover up going on now? There were all these questions and all this attention on the crash. And obviously, if there was some sort of group or agency behind this Gander crash, the last thing they would want is any sort of public or media attention on the crash. They just wanted people to accept the official story that Ice on the Wings had caused the crash and just kind of forget about this whole thing. And that just didn't happen because there was all this attention on the Gander crash and all these mysteries that surrounded it. So, if this Challenger explosion was staged to divert attention away from the Gander crash, it really worked like a charm. And it was only something as big and massive as this Challenger explosion that could have accomplished that. Because again, this Gander crash was a big story right after it happened. 250 soldiers dead, the worst air disaster in US military history, and there were all these mysteries surrounding the crash. It really was a very big story. And in order to push something like that, to the side, you would need something just absolutely massive to one up that and, make people kind of forget about the Gander crash. And it's also very interesting to me how the Gander crash and the Challenger explosion happened right around the same time. The Gander crash was almost 50 times more deadly than the Challenger explosion, but the Gander crash really just got ignored after this Challenger explosion happened. And over the years and in the years since, the Gander crash has just been forgotten about. And this whole thing of these Challenger astronauts potentially being found decades later, I mean, it really is incredible. It's very bizarre. I do find it interesting that this Challenger launch was essentially a military operation for these people, had very extensive backgrounds with the military, and two of them worked for major military contractors. And so maybe these military people were told by higher ups, hey, this attention on this Gander crash that just happened, it's getting intense. There's some really powerful people who might be looking at, getting in some serious trouble. We need you guys to take one for the team and participate in this staged event and help us to get people and get the media focusing on something else. Now, the question that always comes up with this whole strange story of these Challenger astronauts potentially being found is always why? What's the motive? Why would they do this? And there's your motive, to conceal Iran-Contra and protect the very powerful people involved. And if that was indeed the case, it nearly worked like a charm, because the Gander crash and the attention being paid to it just totally disappeared. The links to what was going on with the whole Iran-Contra situation, that those weren't revealed for another year. Remember, it was only because that Eugene Hassenfuss survived the crash and told everything about the whole Iran-Contra arrangement. That's the only reason Iran-Contra even got out. And again, that was a year after the whole Gander crash. And even then, what was actually revealed and what came out about Iran-Contra was probably only just part of the story that came out during the hearings and everything. That was only the tip of the iceberg, as some of these other books and whistleblowers have talked about over the years. This whole Iran-Contra thing was much, much, much bigger than what was revealed. And then to end the video, we'll just kind of talk about some strange assorted facts about the Challenger explosion and the astronauts who were supposedly on the shuttle. And this first fact I find really interesting. So, right after the explosion happened, NASA confiscated the film from the journalists, from the cameras of the journalists who were there to cover it. And these journalists were really pissed. They claimed it was unconstitutional and it was like a Nazi Germany type tactic. And they even described what had happened. And it's kind of a crazy story. So, they said they were, approached and asked to get into a van with NASA officials and just hand over the film from their camera before they'd even had a chance to review it or look at it. So it's definitely interesting that NASA just impounded all the film of the explosion. And then there's Krista McAuliffe. Sharon McAuliffe is her real name. She was the teacher who supposedly won the nationwide, teachers in space competition and beat out thousands of other teachers who'd applied to be the first teacher in space. Of all those thousands of people, she was, supposedly chosen, but she's got some interesting connections. So the Sharon McAuliffe, who was found in 2015, is cousins with this guy. This is Terry McAuliffe. He was the governor of Virginia for a while, and he chaired up the presidential runs of Bill and Hillary Clinton back in the day. So he's definitely a power player. Seems a little coincidental that if, this 1985 Sharon McAuliffe and this 2015 Sharon McAuliffe are indeed the same person, that, the person who just happened to win this teachers in space competition is governor, or is the cousin of, the guy who eventually became governor of Virginia and is very tight with the Clintons. Here's an article where this Sharon McAuliffe is quoted after Terry McAuliffe was inaugurated as the governor of Virginia. And then this Sharon McAuliffe's husband is named Stephen McAuliffe. And so we mentioned, like, everybody on the Challenger crew, everyone of the Challenger crew, they all had military connections except for Krista McAuliffe. She was just a teacher. Her husband, though, definitely had some military connections. He graduated from the Virginia Military Institute. And I find this story kind of strange because right before the Challenger, space shuttle departed, he gave his wife, Krista, he gave her his class ring from the Virginia Military Institute. So that was the gift he gave her to take into space with her. And it seems like I just kind of felt it was a bit of a strange gift to give to your wife. You figure, you would give your wife, maybe your wedding band or something that holds significance for your relationship or something from your kids or your family, something that represents that. But instead, this guy, her husband, gave her his class ring from the Virginia Military Institute. And then this Stephen McAuliffe, he became a federal judge. He was actually the chief judge of the District of New Hampshire for a while. And he was appointed by our guy, George Bush, who we have talked about extensively throughout this video. Here's the Stephen McAuliffe with future President Joe Biden in 1992. And then this Stephen McAuliffe still, is active as a judge. He just kind of made a few headlines when he heard a case about, the hot button issue of transgender athletes participating in women's sports. And this next bit of info I personally find very interesting. So, two of these astronauts had connections to Howard Hughes. Ron McNair and Greg Jarvis both worked for Hughes Aerospace. And I already did one video on just the absolute insanity of the Howard Hughes story. It is so bizarre. Tons of links to the CIA, the FBI, all these shadowy organizations. The whole thing is just a real mystery. And I do find it interesting that these two guys, worked for a Howard Hughes company. And then there's a YouTube page from this YouTube user. His name is Stars Not Far 432. And he actually tracked down a few of these astronauts or doppelgangers or, whatever, and asked him about this whole bizarre, like, Challenger mystery and whether they're the same people. There's Michael Smith on the left there, who was a dead ringer for the Challenger astronaut, Michael Smith. He kind of answered a few questions and seemed a little nervous, but perhaps that's understandable if you're just being approached by a random person. And then this Judith Resnick, she just right when he mentioned Challenger, she just ran away. She refused to answer any questions. So there are definitely some interesting, videos to watch. And Judith Resnick is kind of an interesting case too because she just happened to have a acting part in this movie from I think like 2009, somewhere around there. Fair Game, Naomi Watts movie, and it's about a CIA operative whose life is in danger because her identity gets leaked, and so she goes on the run. And this movie, just this Judith Resnick just happened to be cast in the movie. And so there is this kind of weird CIA connection because the movie's about the CIA. It's definitely strange that, some because she's a professor at Yale, of all the actresses and other professors and all these people who could have been in this movie. It's kind of random and very strange that they would just randomly pick this professor from Yale to be in the movie, but she was in the movie. And then there's astronaut Ron McNair and his brother Carl. Their situation is kind of a bit of a controversy. You can see, I mean, they just look absolutely identical. But if you zoom in, you can kind of see that this Carl McNair in the suit, he has like a gap in between his teeth in the front. And Ron McNair did not have that gap. So a lot of people kind of hold that up as evidence that, they're different people. Interestingly, if you do look at Ron McNair and like zoom in on some of these older photos of him, you can see a pretty prominent gap in his teeth. It's just not in the middle, like with Carl. And so it's almost like, maybe one of his teeth could have been slightly moved over and created a gap in the middle. Or, obviously they could be, two different people, two separate people. But this Ron McNair definitely does have um, some sort of gap between his teeth. But the bigger controversy with Ron and Carl McNair is that Carl McNair actually wrote a book about his brother. It's like early 2000s around there. So it's a pretty older book, but it was a number of years after the Challenger explosion. But in the book, he does include a number of photos of, him and his brother, who, he claims it's him and his brother Ron. So that's there's kind of some debate on whether this Carl McNair, he might actually be like a real person and actually different from Ron McNair. His situation and issue is definitely one of the more kind of like debated things with this whole Challenger mystery. And then there's this Challenger Center. It's a nonprofit that was established right after the Challenger explosion. They have a whole bunch of locations throughout the nation that are kind of just like science centers used to, educate people and educate children about space. And this is a big business. They had revenues last year of around $5 million. And again, this was established by the family members of, the deceased astronauts. Here they are, they're all on the board. And here they are at like a black tie event. I find this photo a little strange, to be honest, because they don't really look like grieving widows or people who've had their hearts ripped from their chest after losing, a loved one. This photo is, quite a bit after the whole Challenger, explosion did happen. So it's not like it's a, photo right after the explosion or anything, but they definitely don't look like, grieving people who were just totally devastated by, losing their loved one in the explosion. But hey, everybody grieves in different ways. This is June Scobie Rogers, and she's kind of like the face of the whole Challenger Center. Interestingly, she's really tight with George Bush, our boy George Bush. She posted about how great a friend she was with him on Facebook after he passed away, and then she was also interviewed about her close relationship with Barbara Bush after Barbara Bush died a few years ago. And then this is Richard Scobie, who is the son of Dick Richard Scobie, the Challenger astronaut, and this June Scobie right here. And this guy's a really big deal in the Air Force. He was the commander of the Air Force Reserve Command, which meant he was in charge of all Air Force reserve units in the world. So again, there's that. There's a lot of military connections here, with this Challenger explosion, and this is another one. And then a common question that does come up is, well, if this whole thing was kind of planned out and these deaths were hoax, why would these people continue to use the same names? And it is an interesting question. It really is. This was obviously before the internet, where finding anything out about a person was virtually impossible. It's interesting that if there is something going on here, these similarities between these, living people and the astronauts who supposedly died, this wasn't found until 2015. So it is interesting that, 30 years passed until this weird connection was uncovered. And then this is a really interesting book about the Federal Witness Protection Program and just how kind of complicated it is. It's really not as simple as just like snapping your fingers and getting new identities for all, 6 or 7 of these people. It's kind of like an unstable program too. There have been plenty of cases where identities have leaked and, information about people has gotten out. So it's not like this whole federal witness protection program, it's not just like this well-oiled machine. So as far as these astronauts keeping the same name, maybe, the people involved just wanted to involve the bare minimum amount of people, and it was easier just to, have these people, these astronauts disappear for, a year or two and then reappear with the same names and not have to go through all this bureaucratic red tape that is involved and that's talked about in this book with the witness protection program. And then the final interesting thing about this Challenger mystery is this thing is like attacked and ridiculed really more than any, mystery or conspiracy or whatever, really more than anything that I've ever seen. There are just all these articles debunking it and talking about how crazy it is. It's almost like it's a coordinated effort to just really convince people that this is crazy and get prevent people from looking into it. I found this interesting. So if you Google like, did the Challenger crew survive? Like, and that's what most people would do. If you told people about this, like, hey, there's this crazy Challenger mystery, check it out. They would Google like, did the Challenger crew survive? If you do Google that or search for it online, all these just mainstream articles come up. And interestingly, all these articles were published on the exact same day in 2021 in all these different newspapers and various publications online. They were all written by different people. There was no real reason for these articles to come out. It wasn't like an anniversary of the Challenger explosion or anything like that. And these articles mention nothing at all about this whole mystery of the Challenger astronauts being found. All they talk about is, supposedly 30 years after the Challenger explosion, it was just randomly discovered that the astronauts didn't die in the explosion and they actually died falling to the earth after the explosion. But the story of them potentially being found and living to this day, I mean, that's the real story. That's the real mystery. That's what's really intriguing. And these articles mention nothing about that. This is a good example of how, these search results are just totally manipulated to bury these stories. Because again, all these articles, they all have nearly identical headlines about the Challenger crew surviving. They all, use the term surviving in the headline. They were all written by different people and they all appeared on the same day. And these are the results that are returned if you, search online for this mystery. You can't, it's very, it makes it very difficult to find, articles that actually discuss the whole mystery of them, surviving to this day. Those articles are, buried and very difficult to find. And again, it just kind of seems like there's this real coordinated effort to just like really take this whole Challenger mystery down and make people think it's crazy and not get them to look into it at all. I mean, I don't think it's crazy. I don't think it's ridiculous. To me, it's ridiculous to look at all these really strange things that were going on with this and just dismiss it and not at least be curious about it. I think it's kind of ridiculous if you don't find this weird. The similarities between a lot of these people are just absolutely striking. A lot of them are just nearly identical. And the fact that the names match too is, certainly interesting. And again, the question that always comes up when you look at this Challenger mystery is, well, why? Why would anyone just hoax something like this? Why would anyone, do something on the scale of blowing up a space shuttle? What could be the possible motive there? And I really do think it could have been tied up in Iran-Contra and tied up in diverting attention away from Iran-Contra and away from this Gander crash that could have exposed Iran-Contra. It is just incredible the more I've looked into Iran-Contra, just how massive this was and how massive it could have potentially been. Just the official story is crazy, but the behind-the-scenes story is even crazier. Pretty sure this will be my next video, so I'm really looking forward to that one. At any rate, I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you soon with another one.